and gentlemen,
can I please have your attention? Can you dig it?
Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. It's Friday morning, and I apologize in advance because I do this morning tweet thing. It's a silly little thing. People like it. It began during the pandemic, where I take a picture of Pippa every morning. Pippa's our crazy English Springer Spaniel, and she tells you what day of the week it is, and it has some observation or complaint or pithy aside, and then says, also, I love you. Because she loves everybody. She goes up to people and just says, will you love me? And it was a cute little joke. And the reason it started during the pandemic was with all the lockdowns and people staying at home, people were forgetting what day of the week it was. And so it was like a little reminder thing. And then it just sort of took on a life of its own. Anyway, the only reason I bring it up is today Pippa got the day of the week wrong. And she said that it was Thursday when it is in fact Friday. And it threw a lot of people for a loop. Of course, no one actually blames Pippa. They bizarrely blame me for it. But anyway, it started the morning off in a weird way. Speaking of weird things, so yesterday I moderated, hosted whatever my old boss Ben Wattenberg used to call himself an immoderator, the Dispatch podcast. And it was fun. The reason I was doing it was Sarah was somewhere, and so was Steve, and David, went off to the hinterlands. And so it fell to me to do it. Sorry, I'm distracted. My text thing, I have it on Do Not Disturb, but I can see it coming in, and everyone's talking about how, I didn't dig the grave deep enough. Anyway, so I had to do this thing. I've talked about this before. A lot of the, more refined podcasts with hosts, who remove the dishes from the sink before they urinate in it, and, wear belts. A lot of the fancier podcasts, they'll do this thing, which Sarah does, which is like she'll announce the topics at the top of the show to keep people on board to the end. The best example of this is the Economist's Intelligence podcast, which I listen to quite a bit. In many ways, I think of it as sort of like what a Morning Dispatch podcast might be if we had the resources that the Economist has. And each one is three topics. And the thing that they do is they begin by saying the second and third topics, like they pitch those, and then they go, but first, and then they do the main topic thing. And it keeps you hanging on. Sometimes it has the result of letting you stop after the first one or first two because you don't care about the third. But generally speaking, it's done really, really well. Sarah does this. We're going to be talking about this. We're going to be talking about that. We're going to talk about this other thing. And then we're going to ask this last thing. And I feel like this podcast could use that kind of structure. The problem, of course, is as I am sitting here alone at my desk, rambling, and I never know where these things are going to go. But I usually take notes in the form of writing like 3 or 4 things down. So here's what I wrote down. I have no idea if we'll get to it all. I wrote Pippa Day. I wrote Hayek versus Kristol, Doomsday Clock, Schumpeter's Children. This really does sound like a very, very, very dorky intro to the categories on Jeopardy. And finally, Classified Docs - Jessica. And this is, I got to tell you, something that, this is a problem with a lot of politicians. It was a big problem with Trump, that they always listen to the last person they talk to. And every morning before I do this, the last person I talk to is my lovely bride, Jessica Gavora, who, I still get emails about that podcast I did with her, about how much people liked it. I'm almost tempted to listen to it because I'm used to talking to my wife, and the fact that so many people found it charming makes me wonder what they hear that I don't hear, because sort of like fish don't know they're wet kind of thing. Anyway, it's not a huge problem because I think my wife is a brilliant and talented lady and knows a lot of things, and usually they're good conversations to have. But she has an outsized influence on what ends up as topics on here, as does, I'm afraid to say, on the other side of the coin, the TV show Morning Joe, because that's often in the background, though I find myself muting it more and more for various and sundry reasons. Classified docs dash Jessica for 200 dispatch listeners, or Remnant listeners. So I don't have a lot more to say about the classified documents stuff. We'll see what other shoes drop. I mean, it's, the phrase, shoes drop is a weird, archaic one to begin with, but probably just need, millipedes wearing sneakers, given how often this is happening now. But we talked about this a bunch on the Dispatch Live podcast. We talked about it on the Dispatch podcast itself. And those guys over at AO have done it a lot as well. I don't want to talk about the politics of it. There is this one point, though, that, keeps coming up about in this debate about overclassification. And yeah. I want to be very clear. The only reason we're talking about overclassification is because Biden is in trouble. And if this was all still a story about Trump, we wouldn't be talking about the scourge of overclassification in the way that we are now, which doesn't mean that we don't classify too much stuff. I think it's a true observation, but if you weren't bothered by it before it became a problem for Biden, maybe you should sit out a couple plays. I've always been somewhat sympathetic to Moynihan wrote a great book on this. I think it was just called Secrecy. And I liked it because Patrick Moynihan, I liked it because it was at a very high level of generalization in some ways. It was just talking about the problem of secrecy itself. And then, would dip down below the clouds to address specific things. I do think, but so everybody who wants to talk about the problem of overclassification in some sort of profound philosophical sense talks about how it is a problem for democracy and accountability and all of that. And I agree with a lot of that. I think that there is a general tendency among people in power to try to do everything they can to inflate the importance of the stuff that they're doing. And one way of doing that is by putting some sort of, metaphorical, wax seal with your signet ring saying this is a holy document. And that kind of thing happens a lot. At the same time, and this is why I bring in the fair Jessica, as listeners probably recall, she worked for the Department of Justice. She worked for John Ashcroft when he was Attorney General during the War on Terror stuff. And part of her job was to write speeches and statements making the public case for the administration's policies and the Justice Department's policies in combating the War on Terror. And the problem she ran into all of the time was that when they were trying to make, the case, and we can debate whether it was the right policy or not, that's not my point. But when she was trying to make the case for why, the DOJ needed this authority, or that the administration was right to do that, she would want to cite examples of plots that have been thwarted, threats that have been identified, threats that are still ongoing. And, as my wife was saying, is the FBI would just simply say, nope, that's all secret. You can't know any of it. Or you can't talk about any of it publicly. And so I just think it's an interesting point insofar as we talk about how this secrecy stuff prevents holding public officials accountable, and it does. But the secrecy stuff also prevents, we always think about accountability as like punishing people when they're doing wrong. But accountability is also about supporting people when they're doing right. And if you can't release some of this information for any number of reasons, sources and methods to just sort of hoarding secrets, whatever, if you can't release the information that proves that what you're doing is correct or justifiable, it actually erodes support for what government is doing. So I think it cuts both ways. And I just thought it was an interesting point that hadn't really occurred to me. So where to go from here? Let's talk about the Doomsday Clock. I might write about this. I had to do CNN the other night, very late. I don't mind. People at CNN have been great to me. I understand people's complaints about CNN. I would argue from a legitimate conservative perspective and as a longtime sort of liberal media critic type, that CNN's moving in a better direction and all that. But, discount my views all you like. They pay me to be on their TV. But anyway, I was on CNN the other night. Happy to do CNN, but they wanted me to do the 11 p.m. show. And let me just say, I am not wired anymore. I have sort of curated my life to wake up at dawn or pre-dawn with dogs and get most of my work done, most of my creative work done in the mornings and staying up that late. Because the problem is it's not just, being in the studio till midnight. It's then you have to drive home. You're completely sober, obviously. And you're kind of caffeinated and wired up and you're thinking about what you said, what you didn't say. It's about a half-hour drive home, and it's really difficult to fall asleep. And so, anyway, it put me off my feed for 2 days. Nice people, perfectly fine, all that, but they wanted me to talk about the Doomsday Clock, and it is a sign of what a born and raised Cold War anti-communist guy that I am, that I kind of went off. You're supposed to send little talking points about where you come down on the different topics and that kind of thing. And I sent a note to the booker saying, just so you know, I think the Doomsday Clock is hot garbage. It's propaganda, etc. And I do believe that. I think that when you think about it, it's difficult for me to think of, and I'd be interested to hear from listeners about other examples, but of a more successful, you can call it propaganda if you want, but a more successful PR gimmick in American history, I cannot think of one. Right? This thing was created in 1947 for defensible, understandable reasons. It was a bunch of, some of the guys from the Manhattan Project were in full, my God, what have we done mode, and wanted to warn the world about the dangers of nuclear proliferation and nuclear war. And so they came up with this clock. And my understanding is that the artist made it 7 minutes to midnight because that looked cool. And it wasn't really based on anything. And since then, it's taken on this, it's become like this sort of a cottage industry think tank profit center. If you go to the Bulletin, it's put up by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. That's the name of the organization. And it's both sort of a think tank and a public and a journal. And I got no problem. Look, I come from think tank world. I think think tanks are fine. I mean, they're good think tanks and they're bad think tanks. There were once good think tanks that are becoming bad think tanks. There's all sorts of, there are think tanks that are, that have always been in the pocket of certain interests. There are other think tanks that haven't. There's certain think tanks that are very ideological. There are other think tanks that are very academic. We could have my friend Tevi Troy on here, and we could talk at great length about the variety and differences between different kinds of think tanks. He wrote a book on think tanks. So I got no problem with think tanks per se. I have no problem with think tanks putting out statements or opinions or declarations or warnings or any of that kind of stuff. But the Bulletin for Atomic Scientists is basically just a magazine, an ideological good. I'm not saying or good or bad, but I don't think it's a bad publication or anything like that. Nor do I think the organization is necessarily quote unquote bad. I have my disagreements with it, but it's just another think tank, basically left of center, with a certain focus on certain kinds of issues, climate change, biosecurity, and of course, arms control and nuclear weapons, that puts out an opinion every year. And if you look at the coverage that the Doomsday Clock gets every frickin' year, it's infuriating. It's always, scientists say we're closer to annihilation than ever. That was this year. Scientists say we're moving 1 minute back from the brink. Scientists warn, blah, blah, blah. And it's kind of like in the, I know I bring this up a lot, but, in Parks and Recreation, there's this cult, that worships a lava-breathing giant lizard that's going to destroy the earth, named Zorp. But the cult calls itself the Reasonableists. The reason is they figured that they could paint anybody who attacked them as being against reason. Just because these guys call themselves scientists and lean into the scientists, and they have scientists working there, don't get me wrong, but so do like literally hundreds of think tanks have some scientists, but there is nothing particularly scientific about this doomsday clock thing. It is just a piece of pro-arms control, mildly sort of peacenik propaganda. And if you read the fine print from some of the people who work there, they'll say so, but they still want the headline saying scientists say this, scientists say that. And, part of my problem with it, going back to the earliest days of the Cold War, is that it is using sort of fear, grounding it in the aura of science, grounding it in the aura of expertise, basically saying, hey, look, this isn't just our opinion from a bunch of people with sort of political commitments and priors. We're scientists. And saying that basically any interruption or diversion from their pro-arms control agenda is bringing us closer to nuclear annihilation, and you should heed our warning. And it just checks so many of the boxes of my peeves about how we do public discourse. There are whole sections I could quote you from all three of my books that pertain to all of this stuff. But, part of the problem is like, even if the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists was written and run entirely by physicists and other, hard sciences guys, engineers, whatever, they don't have particularly authoritative expertise on how the war in Ukraine is going to play out, never mind climate change and, misinformation. That's the thing, is that this year they moved the clock closer to midnight, and midnight represents the total annihilation of life on Earth and the human race. And we're now, I don't know, like seconds, I can't remember how many seconds from midnight we are, because Ukraine could lead to a nuclear war, and because people are saying untrue things on the internet, and climate change is bad. And how are these people the best qualified in the world to render this quote unquote scientific judgment? Why are so many journalistic outlets, from the New York Times and NPR to CNN, all down the list, willing to credit these people with some sort of carve out from the usual, skepticism about that should go towards one advocacy group or another? If the National Association of Plumbers came out with a, doomsday clock, everyone would say, well, who are plumbers to tell us this? Right. But because a bunch of people who may or may not know something about, nuclear warheads, which at this point, everyone knows that nuclear weapons and a global thermonuclear war could destroy all life on Earth. So their contribution to our understanding is pretty minimal, because we already know, everyone knows the main point that they're trying to make, and that they were main point they were trying to make in 1947. No one is under the impression that a total global thermonuclear war wouldn't be pretty bad. But they don't have any particular expertise when it comes to towards military engagements, towards the efficacy of diplomacy and all these kinds of things. I mean, they have people who are experts on this stuff, but so does the American Enterprise Institute. So does the Carnegie Endowment. So does this, Center for Strategic Studies. So do dozens of other places have experts. And no one, when the Carnegie Endowment or Brookings puts out a statement about something, no one says, scientists say. They say, these experts say this, and from a left of center think tank or a right of center think tank or whatever. And the bigger problem with the doomsday clock thing is they've just been wrong for 70 frickin' years. They've been saying that we are I think the furthest away from total global annihilation was 17 minutes. Like what happens in these 17 minutes? It's a total poetic, metaphorical, almost Dali-esque piece of garbage. There's no scientific risk analysis going on here. It is just simply a, hey, everybody, wet your pants, you should be scared kind of thing. And it shouldn't get the sort of authority, be granted the kind of authority that it has. Moreover, it shouldn't be scaring the hell out of everybody. I mean, just taking them on their own terms. If Putin uses a battlefield tactical nuke in Ukraine, there are a lot of experts who say that would be a huge military blunder on Putin's part. The only reason to do it would be for psychological reasons. And there's lots of reason to believe that it would not actually deter Ukrainians. It would probably just amp it up. Or it might deter them, or it might deter NATO, or it might amp up NATO. The point is that these are not scientific judgments to make. These are not things that are fed into a supercomputer and give us the objective truth. And telling people, particularly young people, for 70 years that we are seconds away from total annihilation actually isn't good for preventing total annihilation. If you tell people there's no hope, first of all, a lot of people aren't going to have kids. Second of all, they're not going to live in a way where they think it's worth their effort to make meaningful contributions to improving society. This is the part of the problem you get into with the climate change stuff is like scaremongering is of a much more limited utility than people think. It kind of reminds me of, I must have told this story before. There was some great documentary about The Who. And this is not an Abbott and Costello routine. I'm alone. Pete Townsend was telling the story. I think it was Pete Townsend telling the story about how, when they were first starting out, Townsend broke a guitar. That's part of his thing back then. And they would smash up a club or whatever, or a hotel room. And the manager would have these band meetings and say, guys, we got to talk. We are 5,000 pounds in debt. And everyone would freak out because these are young, relative poor guys, right? It's just starting out. And like, oh my God, we're screwed. What are we going to do? We really got to, we got to really change our ways and fix this situation. And then 6 months later, they would have another band meeting. Boys, we are now 25,000 pounds in debt. And they would pull their hair and say, oh my gosh, let's get religion. Let's put ourselves on a budget. We got to stop this. Maybe we'll break cheaper guitars, whatever. And then 6 months later, or a year later, whatever, the band manager says, boys, we are 1 million pounds in debt. And Pete Townsend and Daltrey and all these guys are like, all right, well, screw it. Right? Let's have fun because we're never paying that back. And when you go around telling people that, when you just start pumping, the basic raw materials of nihilism and fatalism into the culture, any benefit you get from a warning that this clock represents is negated by the kind of fatalism and nihilism that you're breeding. And I just think the press should be ashamed of themselves for taking this thing as seriously as they have for so long. And kudos to the guys at the Bulletin for Atomic Scientists, again, which has good people and bad people. I looked it up, like one guy who's on the board, very smart guy, great, nice guy knows a lot about arms control stuff. I used to know 25 years ago in the dog park in Colorado. He had a great dog back then. There's appear to be some very serious scientists on this board. This is the board that figures out where to move the minute hand. And then there are some real scientist guys. And then there's Jerry Moonbeam Brown, the former governor of California, is the executive chair of this commission. Now, I'm willing to defer on all sorts of questions, including to Brown, about certain technical things, because they know things about certain technical things. But I am not willing to defer to any of these people about how close we are to total annihilation. And by the way, just one last thing. It's like, I wish like the original idea of the Doomsday Clock, which was this nuclear bombs could wipe us out in an instant, which is true, right? Or mostly true. At least the metaphor inherent in the clock made a little sense. But now one of the other major criteria is climate change. And I'm sorry, like climate change could be as big a problem as what is it? I can't remember what EPCC, whatever, the climate, alarmists, whatever, it can be as big a deal as Al Gore says it is. The timeline for total annihilation of human beings on Earth from climate change, I don't think we even know what that is, because like the last time the UN EPCC thing, whatever that thing is, last time I looked at it, they were predicting bad things 100 years from now if we do nothing today. But by bad things wasn't the total annihilation of human life or all life on planet Earth. I've done this a bunch of times where, Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden, all these guys kept talking about how climate change posed an existential, extinction level threat to life on Earth. And it just factually doesn't, even on the terms of the experts who say it's a huge problem. But regardless, just the timeline for that is just completely different than the timeline for how you would calculate everyone going out in a global thermonuclear war, or whether even a global thermonuclear war is imminent. And so anyway, it's garbage. It's garbage. And the big Cold War reason why I hated it is that it was always intended to scare Western leaders out of their resolve. The Soviet Union loved that thing because it was a way to intimidate the West and raise the stakes in the Cold War rivalry. It was sort of like Gandhi's BS about, nonviolence, which he only ever aimed at. I don't say nonviolence is BS. I'm saying his double standard for nonviolence is BS. I think Martin Luther King used it very, very effectively and nobly and all that. So I'm not saying that nonviolence is a bad doctrine. I'm saying that the way Gandhi used it, he basically said that, he never told Hitler not to, that violence doesn't solve anything. He told, he only used that on the West and on the Brits, because the Brits and the West generally have had a rightly formed conscience and were susceptible to these arguments in ways that our enemies aren't or don't. Certainly in the case of the Nazis and the Soviets, and so this scaremongering thing was always intended to scare Western voters, Western populations. Every time Reagan did anything with Star Wars SDI stuff or missiles in Western Europe stuff, the Doomsday Clockers would get their dresses over their heads and say, this is bringing us closer to the brink of annihilation. We have, totally predictably, the Russians this week responded to the Doomsday Clock thing by saying how we should all take this very, very seriously, because they're trying to intimidate Ukraine and the West with nuclear weapons. And they want people to be scared of Russia using nuclear weapons. And I just hate to say it, but the Doomsday Clock people are aiding and abetting Russia here. And it's gross. And it's gross the way the media covers this thing as if it's serious. And it's just crap. All right, I'm done. I apologize for getting worked up. So this week I had Bruce Caldwell on, who's basically the definitive Hayek guy in the country at this point. He's co-writing a 2-volume biography of Hayek. He's written a lot about Hayek. He knows a great deal about Hayek. I'm talking about the economist and social theorist, some would say philosopher, Friedrich Hayek, who won the Nobel Prize in 1974. I should have, now I think about it, I should have talked to Caldwell about his Nobel Prize because there was a lot of politics involved in that. I believe the same year they gave it to Gunnar Myrdal, and it was sort of like this balance. The left gets one and the right gets one kind of thing. But we had this discussion that I will freely admit was prompted in part by something Yuval Levin, my friend and boss at the American Enterprise Institute, suggested I ask him about, which was there's no way of doing this without getting kind of eggheady and weedy. So if you want to put it on 1.5 speed or skip, a couple of minutes, I'll understand. I won't take offense. Hayek has this argument in the Constitution of Liberty that gets at notions of justice and a just society. And I asked about this in the sense that it comes across as sort of as a what do you want to call it, radical or not? It feels kind of radically utilitarian insofar as Hayek rejects the idea, or appears to reject the idea, that you can even have a just society. And I've often struggled with this part of Hayek, in part because, as I think I mentioned when I was talking to Caldwell, one of the biggest intellectual influences on me was Irving Kristol. And Irving wrote this really fantastic essay called When Virtue Loses All Her Loveliness. We'll put it in the show notes. You can, just so you know, you can find the archives of the public interest, which was one of my favorite things, at the National Affairs website. It takes some clicking, but you can find it. And there's just so much great stuff back in there that if you're interested, you should poke around. You should just look for things written by Irving Kristol, James Q. Wilson, Nat Glazer. I don't want to keep listing because then it'll be like, why didn't you list so-and-so? But it's great stuff. Anyway, and in this essay, Irving was always a two cheers for capitalism guy for reasons that I've always respected. I've always been more of I should say I used to be a two cheers. Now I'm a 2.5 cheers. I'm a 3 cheers if you can say capitalism rightly understood. But anyway, that's really a longer conversation. Maybe that's something to write about. But, Irving's problems, with capitalism I would argue, deeply influenced by Daniel Bell, who was deeply influenced, and Joseph Schumpeter, and a bunch of people, about how one of the problems with capitalism or the free market is that it tends to not, it's sort of like water, right? Water seeks its level regardless of what's in front of it. And water, digs canyons through the landscape, and it doesn't say, well, we'll go around the pretty parts. It only will say we'll go, water, again, I don't mean to anthropomorphize water, but water just goes where its nature and where the context allows. And so if there's a big boulder, it'll go around the boulder. But over time, it'll wear down even the boulder. And the sort of the through line criticism of capitalism from sort of the neoconservatives and others who are generally pro-market and pro-capitalism is that capitalism over time erodes even the virtues that make capitalism possible, right? Capitalism erodes the family, capitalism erodes traditional religion, and over time, and those are the well springs of social capital from which capitalism emerges and cannot survive without. I've always thought that there was a lot of merit to this argument, but I also thought there were drawbacks to it. And I'm not going to get super deep in the weeds onto both, because that's the kind of thing I should probably prepare in my head a little bit more than I have this morning. But the sort of argument, I think, and I tend to think that all of this comes out of Schumpeter. I should get an intellectual historian on here to tell him, because there's this thing. I know I'm rambling here. I apologize. I'm just trying to get my head together. I'm one of these guys who loves the begats of intellectual history. In the Bible, there's, Josiah begat Hedadiah, Begiah, blah, blah, blah. And you just go through this long family tree kind of thing. I love the begats when it comes to certain aspects of intellectual history. And I kind of think that Daniel Bell, James Burnham, Irving Kristol, all these guys are more indebted to Schumpeter than is often recognized. I'm not saying that these guys aren't huge monumental thinkers in their own right. I just think that a lot of these arguments about the managerial revolution, about the new class, all these things, they really come out of Schumpeter. I'd be kind of curious if there's, if this turtles all the way down. I'm kind of curious what turtles people would say come before Schumpeter. I can think of some, but anyway, that's all a digression. Where was I? Oh, so the cultural contradictions of capitalism. It is true. This is an idea that comes up every few years as if it's a novel insight. There'll be someone who say, conservatives don't even understand that capitalism is, hostile to traditional values and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, yeah, I know the argument. Anyway, so that's where Irving comes from a little bit on this. And, the sort of a lot of the neocon thinkers on these grounds, want to unleash free market and libertarian principles on the stuff that they don't like, but they also want to build high walls around the stuff that they do like. And I do too. I think there's certain institutions that would be destroyed if we made them capitalist. It'd be horrific if the Catholic Church simply became a for-profit institution. We don't have to get into the whole microcosm, macrocosm, Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft stuff again, but the family should not be a for-profit institution. In the same way, for-profit institutions cannot be run like families. So anyway, back to Hayek, right? So Hayek, who hated the concept of social justice, as do I, and one of the reasons I hate it is I find Hayek completely persuasive about the social justice thing. He had what appeared to Irving and others skepticism about the concept of a just society in and of itself. And I have to go back and read the relevant bits of Constitution of Liberty, because it's not like I am in a position to accuse Irving Kristol of lacking reading comprehension. But I'm coming around, for reasons I got into with Caldwell, to think that this is not altogether fair or right. So I pulled up while I was talking and yammering to you, When Virtue Loses All of Her Loveliness. And let me just read some excerpts. Again, feel free to skip ahead. Feel free to go listen to another podcast. It's fine. In the section of this essay subtitled From Bourgeois Society to a quote-unquote Free Society, Irving writes, I can think of no better way of indicating the distance that capitalism has traveled from its original ideological origins than by contrasting the most intelligent defender of capitalism today with his predecessors. I refer to Friedrich von Hayek, who has as fine and powerful a mind as is to be found anywhere, and whose Constitution of Liberty is one of the most thoughtful works of the last decades. In that book, he offers the following argument against viewing capitalism as a system that incarnates any idea of justice. Okay, now I'm going to read, it's a little toothy, the passage that Irving is quoting by Friedrich Hayek. So this is Hayek now. Most people will object not to the bare fact of inequality, but to the fact that the differences in reward do not correspond to any recognizable differences in the merit of those who receive them. Basically, what Hayek is saying here is that complaints about inequality aren't really complaints about inequality. It's complaints that the people who benefit from society don't deserve to. Okay, more Hayek. The answer commonly given to this is that a free society on the whole achieves this kind of justice. This, however, is an indefensible contention if by justice is meant proportionality of reward to moral merit. Any attempt to found the case for freedom on this argument is very damaging to it, since it concedes that material rewards ought to be made to correspond to recognizable merit, and then opposes the conclusion that most people will draw from this by an assertion which is untrue. The proper answer is that in a free society, it is neither desirable nor practicable that material rewards should be made generally to correspond to what men recognize as merit, and that it is an essential characteristic of a free society that an individual's position should not necessarily depend on the views that his fellows hold about the merit he has acquired. And then there's an ellipse or ellipses. A society in which the position of the individual was made to correspond to human ideas of moral merit would therefore be the exact opposite of a free society. It would be a society in which people were rewarded for duty performed instead of for success. Another ellipses, and then, but if nobody's knowledge is sufficient to guide all human action, there is also no human being who is competent to reward all efforts according to merit. And then Irving says, so this is Irving Kristol writing now, this argument is admirable both for its utter candor and for its firm opposition to all those modern authoritarian ideologies, whether rationalist or irrationalist, which give a self-selected elite the right to shape men's lives and fix their destinies according to its preconceived notions of good and evil, merit and demerit. But it is interesting to note what Hayek is doing. He is opposing a free society to a just society. Like, opposing is a bad word here, just so you know. He's basically contrasting or putting in conflict. This is me fixing Irving, which I feel is a sin. Basically, he's saying he is contrasting a free society to a just society. Because he says, while we know what freedom is, we have no generally accepted knowledge of what justice is. Elsewhere, he writes, and then he quotes another passage from Hayek, since differentials in wealth and income are not the effect of anyone's design or intentions, it is meaningless to describe the manner in which the market distributed the good things of this world among particular people as just or unjust. No test or criteria have been found or can be found by which such rules of quote-unquote social justice can be assessed. They would have to be determined by the arbitrary will of the holders of power. And then Irving says, now, it may be this is the best possible defense that can be made of a free society. But if this is the case, one can fairly say that quote-unquote capitalism is or was one thing and a free society another. For capitalism, during the first 100 years or so of its existence, did lay claim to being a just social order in the meaning later given to that concept by Paul Elmer Moore, who said, such a distribution of power and privileges and of property as the symbol and instrument of these as at once will satisfy the distinctions of reason among the superior and will not outrage the feelings of the inferior. What Paul Elmer Moore was saying there, that basically was people basically bought into the idea that if you got rich, you deserved to get rich. And if you were poor, you deserved to be poor. I'm not sure that's entirely true, but whatever. Okay, so I realize that was a lot. And if you're still around, thank you, or what the hell's wrong with you? I don't know. But, you know, I'm just going to geek out on this. Okay, so I'm very proud to say that I pushed back on Bruce Caldwell when he was starting to describe Hayek's system as one of neutral rules and whatnot. And in a familiar refrain on this podcast, I pointed out that what we call neutral rules are in fact deeply and profoundly morally rich rules. In fact, they're among the most morally rich rules ever achieved by humanity, in part because they're successful. And this is a really hugely important point. I can come up with all sorts of really friggin' awesome, superior, closer to God, righteous rules about how to organize society. But if they have no chance of being successfully followed or implemented, who gives a rat's ass? The rules of liberalism aren't just moral in their own right. They're even more moral because they work, because they are successful, because they work at scale and produce better outcomes than alternative rules. And so, again, just to repeat myself, where to start? So, after the Treaty of Westphalia, which concluded the wars of religion or the 100-Year Wars or whatever, the basic consensus that emerged from exhaustion, not from righteous principle, but from exhaustion with murdering people in huge numbers because they disagreed about, what the catechism or some theological thing. I'm not trying to denigrate or dismiss the importance of theological differences between Protestants and Catholics or different kinds of Protestants. I think those are all important on their own terms and whatever. I'm just willing as an outsider to say they're not worth murdering each other over. They're really not worth murdering fellow Christians over. Just call me crazy, okay? Tyranny of small differences is a huge problem in human history. And so one of the things that came out of that period was this idea that we were no longer, when I say we, I mean the West or certain parts of the West, because this spread over time, we're no longer going to settle disputes of conscience with swords and spears. And again, this rule, which had all sorts of exceptions at the time in different places in different contexts, right? But this basic idea emerges because they tried every other system, every other way of going, and it led to a lot of people dying. And so there was and it led to a lot of war and a lot of impoverishment and all the rest. So they're like, all right, let's just stop doing that. And from that emerged whole strands of liberalism about freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of worship. And you get, and those ideas in turn led to flowering of other ideas about liberalism. And again, there are other strains, the right to confront your accuser goes, has a long history to it. This idea that I always focus on, that a man's home is his castle, has a long history to it. And leads inexorably, I shouldn't say inexorably, it leads inevitably to the Fourth Amendment. You can trace various aspects of free speech down to the ancient Greeks. That's all fine. The point is that these ideas, through, one might say, a process of Hayekian trial and error, start to take hold. And when they start to take hold, they start having really positive results in terms of economic growth, in terms of social peace, in terms of flowering of artistic and literary accomplishments. They work. And they work because if you let people's ingenuity, people's innovation, driven by market rewards, proceed without too much meddling and interference by the state, you get this, virtuous cycle of building success upon success, and then you get copycat effects, right? This is, one of the big arguments about how we got capitalism in the first place, is that each nation or city-state, because it was often like in cities, would have modest success by adopting some of these rules. And then another city-state would say, hey, look what they're doing. Let's go even further. And you have a virtuous cycle building upwards. And very quickly, in terms of historical terms, people start getting richer, healthier, and all the rest. This is, again, this is the story of my book in many respects. And, but here's the problem is we take, and I think Irving takes, in this context. And this is the thing, Hayek takes. They're both in error here because they're both working on this assumption that these rules about the liberal order, these rules about, constitutional processes or even biblical processes, right? I mean, like the idea of not murdering people, the idea of not stealing, the idea of being able to worship God as you see fit. Both Hayek and Irving, I would argue, to a certain extent, take these rules for granted and don't incorporate them into their ideas of a just society. They just simply take them for granted. They think it's like the hardware, and they just want to argue about the software. And the problem is that it's all software. And we can see, if you look in Russia, right now, the idea that your property inherently belongs to you is not taken for granted because your property can be taken away from you. The idea that you can't speak your conscience is not taken for granted because you can't speak your conscience. And so a lot of these things that, whether it's Irving and Hayek here or a lot of the post-liberal types today, they just simply stand on the shoulders of those institutions and those rules and think that they can see farther to a better system. But the problem is, to get to that better system, they got to climb off the shoulders of those rules. I know it's not the best analogy, but I think it makes the point. It's sort of like this phrase I always use about people who love to stand on a soapbox and take a sledgehammer to the soapbox that they're standing on. All these people who love free, this is sort of what I was getting at when I was talking to Keith Whittington the other day. So many people love free speech, but some of the people who love it the most are the ones who love to use free speech to argue for taking away the free speech of other people. And so anyway, my point here is, like, I am entirely on Team Hayek when it comes to the question of social justice. And I think that's really what Hayek is getting at. Again, I have to go back and look at the specific passages of Constitution of Liberty. But I don't think if you sat down with Friedrich Hayek, and I would love to know what Hayek thought of this essay. I look forward to reading Caldwell's book if he addresses that, because I just don't believe that if you actually sat down with Professor Hayek, that he would say he has no concept of a just society. And that's what Irving is accusing him of here. At least he's accusing him of it, I think. And the problem with that is that, there's a huge difference between Hayek's arguments about social justice and arguments about justice. Hayek has a lot of views about justice. Hayek loves English common law. He loves, in part because it's iterative, right? It goes from the ground up. It looks at specific cases between specific plaintiffs and defendants, and says, and keeps it all granular and is based on problem solving in the context, right? Two farmers are arguing about who has rights to a creek. The judge doesn't come up with some grand level of abstraction. He starts with, what are the actual facts on the ground that these two people are arguing about? And is there a way consistent with law and tradition to satisfy this to the betterment of everybody? And that's why that's part of Hayek's love of common laws, is basically this trial and error, emergent property kind of stuff. And I just don't believe that Hayek didn't believe that system wasn't part of justice as most people understand what justice is. Right. He was arguably the 20th century's most passionate defender of, liberalism rightly understood. And the ideas and concepts that define classical liberalism are all about concepts of justice. Again, all of your rights, the right to property, the right to speech, the right to free association, free travel, free conscience, all of those things are embedded in liberalism, and they have they are impossible to maintain if they are not part of a conception of justice rightly understood. Where Hayek is arguing about this social justice stuff is he is saying that you cannot live in a society where the powers that be get to decide, well, these kinds of people or this individual is more deserving of basically money or rents from property or whatever, right? But, money, resources, that this person is more deserving or these kinds of people are more deserving. And so therefore we should muck with the normal market processes, the normal operating of civil society, and give these people extra stuff in the name of justice. It's not saying the state can't do that. He's just saying that it's not justice. And if you go back, and I did this for my underrated second book, if you go back and you look at all the different definitions of social justice, there is no working definition of social justice. Social justice is, yes, there is within the Catholic Church, and it's a much different one than the ones that a lot of people on the left want to use. But as a political matter, all social justice means is my team should be in charge of allocating goods and resources. And it's all about redistributive economics. And the problem with it is that there is no conception of social justice in the way that people use it that doesn't involve giving some group of people, some party, some faction, some ruler, the carte blanche to pick winners and losers, to reward allies and punish foes. You can come up with all sorts of, cathedrals of rhetoric about how, but these people really would know how to pick the winners and these people deserve to win and blah, 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 blah. Hayek's just saying that it just doesn't work. But he is also saying it doesn't work in the macrocosm, right? It doesn't work in the part of the world that is about contracts and commerce and how people deal with strangers. Hayek, I am sure, has all sorts of notions of quote unquote social justice for how the family works. I am sure that he has had all sorts of notions about, rewarding children based on things other than pure merit, or distributing resources in the family for reasons other than pure merit. And so I think that basically Hayek and Kristol are talking past each other on this. And it's in part because Hayek is sort of making the same mistake that Irving is, of simply taking for granted the profound moral content that is embedded in liberal democratic capitalism. And I think that one of the problems that we're facing today is the people who want to move beyond liberal democratic capitalism are making the same mistake. I don't think that, most of these guys at Compact or the nationalist, whatever that group is, I don't think they want dictators. And I don't think that they all want to sort of completely overturn property rights and free speech rights and all these kinds of things. I think they probably have a whole suite of policies I disagree with, but I don't think they're mustache twirling villains and would-be totalitarians. What I do think is that they naively want to pocket all of the wins inherent in liberalism, maybe call them something else, maybe ground them in some other doctrine or faith so as to protect them. And then say, but in these other spheres of life, we really should have free reign to sort of meddle and tweak and play games rewarding winners and losers because we're really that smart. And I think one of the things that history shows is that once you concede that kind of authority and expertise to experts or partisans or factions or whatever, because there is no real limiting principle that they can articulate, they end up saying, well, if we just had a little bit more power, a little bit more authority, if we could just get these critics to shut up, then everything would click into place. And it never clicks into place. And I think you can find that story in all sorts of regimes and systems and countries that started out fairly well, had rebellions or elite, transfers that started out fairly high-minded and sincere and with some decent ambitions, and didn't end up that way. And I think that's really kind of the story of the French Revolution. You can make an argument that it's a story of at least the first Russian Revolution, 1905. Definitely, I just think there wasn't a lot of decency to the Bolshevik Revolution. But you get my point. The great thing about liberalism, rightly understood, is that it comes with built-in limitations on what our rulers can do. It doesn't buy into like, oh, well, look, here's a new idea that says if we have the right rulers, they don't have to conform to the rules of limited government and constitutionalism because they're right, and right people shouldn't have to. This gets at the very core of the whole Federalist Papers, if men were angels thing. You don't worry about angels being corrupted or giving themselves permission to go beyond the rules because they're angels. But human beings are really good at rationalizing their wants and desires by making them sound like some sort of necessity in the moment or some grand abstract principle. All right, so I did all that. Got it. I have no idea if people are going to be mad at me about all that. Oh, the last thing I mentioned here was Schumpeter's children. I'm going to have to give this short shrift, but I've been consistent. I've actually talked about all the things, maybe not in the order I said them, but all the things I talked about up front. My friend and beloved former Remnant podcaster, Charles Cook, sent me an email the other day, forwarded me this piece by Andrew Stiles. Let me see if I can find it real quick. Andrew Stiles is this really talented kid. I wish he wrote more. I shouldn't necessarily call him a kid for all I know. He's like 30 now. But he wrote this great piece. It's over the Free Beacon. And the headline is, Analysis. We need a total and complete shutdown of rich white liberals having children. And the subhead is, until we can figure out what the hell is going on. Now, back to Jack for a second. Jack sent me this email just with the subject header, Schumpeter's children. Because Jack, as people know, helped me enormously with Suicide of the West. The big theme of Suicide of the West is that the biggest problem facing the West isn't a lack of pride in Western civilization, isn't a lack of respect for Western civilization. Oh, there is. Yeah, that is a problem. I shouldn't say it that way. It's not that there's a lack of pride. It's that there's a lack of gratitude. We should be extremely grateful and again, we don't have to call it Western civilization. We can call it liberalism. I call it the miracle. But we have a lack of gratitude for the immense moral, social, economic, technological, scientific progress that we have made that was contingent upon all of these things I was talking about earlier about, the stuff that comes out of, after Westphalia about not killing people because of their religious beliefs, about free speech, about innovation, about property rights, about all of these hard won intellectual moral victories that came from tens of thousands of years of trial and error with all sorts of bad ideas that allowed us to sort of to pull ourselves out of the muck of man's natural condition. And when people talk about a lack of patriotism in the United States, what really they're sort of they should better be talking about is a lack of gratitude for the United States. And I'm not saying that you can't criticize the bad stuff because we've done bad things. Bad things have certainly happened at the hands of Americans and American governments, and there's no getting around that. And one of the reasons why you should care about that stuff is because when you look at it, it helps you understand how much progress we've made. But we just basically, we teach people to be ungrateful. We teach people to be entitled. And I think that ultimately is the sort of, the, immune, disease that we have in this country, is that many of our best and brightest, or at least the people who have reason to be the most grateful, basically serve as antibodies, attacking healthy organs of the body politic. And I hate the metaphor of body politic, but they attack our healthy institutions and organs because of an excess of their sense of both justice and entitlement and grievance. And, like literally tearing down statues. I don't mind, I think everything should be done lawfully. But, tearing down or having removed Confederate generals, particularly statues of Confederate generals that were put up in the 1960s as an FU to the civil rights movement, does not bother me in the slightest. And at the other end of the spectrum, tearing down statues of abolitionists who gave their lives fighting to end slavery in the Civil War because they're white dudes in statue form, is among the most idiotic things culturally, philosophically, ethically, morally I can think of. It's just so profoundly stupid. And that's what was happening during the great riot of iconoclasm in the wake of George Floyd. You were at the University of Wisconsin. I wrote about this at the time. They actually started just tearing down statues of like these guys who formed their own brigades to fight the South and end slavery. And because the sort of know-nothing kids just said, ooh, white guy in statue form, he must be bad. And that is a reflexive antibody attack on the good things about our past. It is sort of Howard Zinnism taken to the 10th degree. So anyway, I'm obsessed with this point about Schumpeter, about this point that Schumpeter makes about how the biggest opponents to bourgeois values and capitalist society and market society in general are the people who should be most grateful for it, the children of really rich people. And if you broaden it out to sort of class stuff, the children of bourgeois families, so Lenin didn't grow up poor. Most of the revolutionaries in the Russian Revolution, most of the sort of would-be revolutionaries of sort of the Pure Huron statement, SDS variety, were all kids of privilege. They're just bored, entitled brats who are, sort of what C.S. Lewis would call men without chests, people looking to find meaning in life by attacking this fundamentally decent and successful society because they don't know enough about anything else to attack anything else, and they're bored. So Stiles had this, I thought it was pretty funny piece about running through the examples of all of these kids, like this kid and this girl who's this non-binary person who's the daughter of the number 2 Democrat in the House. I think it's Catherine Murray, is that it? Who was arrested for assaulting a cop last week after she was spray painting all cops are bastards. Anyway, and so I find there's this whole there's this whole trend of the sort of trustafarian, hippie, radical, liberal kids of rich people who take for granted that they should have the time and the resources to go be troublemakers and would-be rebels, with the added, sort of in the back of their head, the knowledge that, the parents are going to bail them out. And they're doing it on behalf of, they think, the downtrodden and oppressed who, first of all, would not take the level of wealth that these people have for granted, but second of all, would benefit far more from, a system, the free market system, than any other system. Anyway, he sent me this thing. It was about Schumpeter, the Schumpeter's children thing. It's a minor obsession of mine. Feel free to send me examples of this kind of thing from time to time. Just put the title Schumpeter's Children in the headline. And I feel like I completely flannel mouth and buttered this segment. But the basic idea is, if you go back and you look throughout history, it is the bored, entitled children of fairly prosperous people who are the revolutionaries, who are the radicals, in part because actual hardworking poor people are too tired and have too many other important priorities to get caught up in sort of boutique salon eggheadery. And just to tie this all together, the forces of social justice all tend to be driven by, I shouldn't say all, but most of these people, they chose these professions, they chose these careers either because they were inoculated to the charms of material prosperity, or they knew they were going to have material prosperity anyway, so they didn't really care, and they thought they could devote themselves to more radical endeavors. This was one of Irving Kristol's major complaints. Again, I think he's downstream of Schumpeter, of what was happening with what he called the new class. You had all of these people, even the people who go into business and particularly go into journalism and academia, they're kind of compromising. They think that they're heroic because they're not pursuing the most highly paid professions. And therefore that makes them rejecting, that means they're rejecting capitalism and bourgeois values and all that kind of stuff. And instead they're picking these sort of managerial class, these intellectual professions, and that radicalism and ingratitude starts to infect what they teach if they go into academia. It infects how they cover the news if they go into journalism. And I think you see that all around. Journalism used to be much more of a blue collar kind of job. There were a lot of people who came from humble beginnings who were sort of like Charlie Lunchbucket types. And now, like, being in journalism is kind of like what being in publishing was in the 40s and 50s, where if you were, or what going into the military or the priesthood was in certain, medieval periods. If you weren't the promising kid of a prosperous family, establishment family in, for a long time in Europe, you, and that was usually the case if you were a second son, because of primogeniture, right? So like you go off into the army, or you move to America, or you become a priest. And in sort of genteel, WASP-dominated America, there were a lot of people who went into publishing because it would allow them to have a really comfortable lifestyle and seem like they were more exotic, but also sort of more accepted. And I think today there are a lot of people who come from very prosperous, very affluent backgrounds who go into journalism and academia as a way to sort of say that they are maintaining their credibility of outside the sort of market system, and lets them sort of be part of this sort of adversarial institution that criticizes and shows profound ingratitude for the system that produced them. Now they take sledgehammers to the soapboxes that they stand on. And the amazing thing is, as I was saying before, with liberalism generally, we tend to see the value and importance of the rights and privileges and obligations of a liberal order when they're taken away from us or when they're threatened. And so the second, you don't have all of your rights in court, or the second you don't have your right to free speech, or the second you don't have your right to free association, all of a sudden, those don't seem like neutral rules anymore. Those seem like profoundly moral rules. Those seem like the essence of how we define justice. And you see lots of journalists who are part of this school of thought, this broader school of thought that thinks the Constitution is this antiquated impediment to social justice, which it is. I mean, it's not antiquated, but it is an impediment to the concept of social justice. And that it holds back sort of the technocratic experts from having their way and doing what they want. And, there's certain certain parts of the Constitution that should be totally dead letters, like the Second Amendment. But the First Amendment, a lot of these people don't like all the sort of religious freedoms that it gives, or the free association freedoms that it at least used to give. But the second Donald Trump started talking about how the press was the enemy of the people and that we have to do something about libel laws, all of a sudden, a lot of people were talking about how important the Constitution was. A lot of people were talking about how deeply morally profound the First Amendment freedoms for the press are. And it just turns out that when you rely on these rights and everything's going fine, you think they're neutral. And then when things change, you realize, no, they're actually profoundly, profoundly moral. And I will now stop talking, and I really apologize for going so long. And